Today we're talking about assessing listening. We're going to be exploring in the next couple of weeks assessing the 4 different skills, specifically different types of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and different strategies to assess these according to the level of language of our students. This is helpful for us not just in assessing but also in planning our classes so that we don't always get stuck doing the same thing, listening and filling in the blank, and for speaking, the most typical role play and dialogue, because there are lots of other ways to practice, and that means there are lots of different ways to assess. So today specifically we're looking at assessing listening, and this comes from the same text that we've been following, which is Douglas Brown, Language Assessment, Principles in Classroom Practice. So there are some basic types of listening that we do. First, we can recognize speech sounds that hold a temporary imprint in our short-term memory. This is what we do when we listen and write the word, but it's not really comprehension, it's just the sound. The second thing we can do is simultaneously determine the type of speech event. This is more like the main idea, well, not the main idea, the gist, the type of thing we're listening to. Is it a monologue? Is it a dialogue? Is it a transactional dialogue, which means that more than one person is talking at the same time? We can also determine the context, like who the speaker is, the location, the purpose, and the content of the message. I think already there should be some bells going off in your mind that there's way more to do with speaking than just working on concrete information. Do we do these types of questions when we have our students listen, like asking them, where are they, what are they trying to communicate, who's speaking? These types of skills in listening are real world skills, so we need to be asking those questions. Another type of listening, we can use bottom-up or linguistic decoding skills, or top-down. You've seen this before in Practica and to bring a plausible interpretation to a message and assign a literal and intended meaning to the utterance. So here we're dealing with sounds and how those sounds are associated with words, and those words with sentences, and this creates meaning. And the last type, in most cases, except for repetition tasks, which involve short-term memory only, you delete the exact linguistic form in which the message was originally received in favor of conceptually retaining important or relevant information in long-term memory. This is why listening to fill in the blank is not the best, because that's not how we actually listen or what we listen for. In real life, nobody asks me for a specific piece of what they said. I need to understand that what was most important about what they told me, what the main idea was, to be able to take notes. That helps me to understand what was most important, and that's how we listen. Some objectives related to types of listening. Well, first, comprehending surface structure elements such as phonemes, words, intonation, or a grammatical category. I think we generally do this. We can also work on understanding pragmatic context, and I think this is huge and we don't do it enough. You probably studied in linguistics pragmatics, which is a subfield of linguistics and semiotics that studies the ways in which context contributes to meaning. Pragmatics encompasses speech act theory, conversational implicature, talk and interaction, and other approaches to language, behavior, and philosophy, sociology, linguistics, and anthropology. That's the definition, but in the end, when we talk about pragmatics, it means like the meaning behind the meaning. So not just what they said, but how they said it, what did they mean to communicate. It's also involving their facial expressions, their gestures, and how all of that contributes to what we're understanding. So here you can see where working not just with audio tracks, but with videos could also be helpful, because body language can help us contribute a lot to what we're understanding when we listen. We can also determine the meaning of auditory input, that's the most general, and develop the gist or global comprehensive understanding. And now we're going to look at 4 different types of listening and look at some examples of how you can assess them. First, a brief overview of what the 4 types are. Intensive, responsive, selective, and extensive. These are the 4 types of listening that we can assess. Intensive is listening for perception of the components of a larger stretch of language: phonemes, words, intonation, discord markers. When you have them listen and fill in the blank, intensive. Responsive, listening to a relatively short stretch of language, like a greeting, command, comprehension check, in order to make an equally short response. So when we have our students participate in dialogues or these role plays, they're not just speaking, they're also listening, because as long as we don't let them like pre-write it out, they are going to have to listen in order to be able to respond. That's why, again, remember that the skills are totally integrated. The third type is selective. And this is processing stretches of discourse, such as short monologues for several minutes, in order to scan for certain information. The purpose of such performance is not necessarily to look for global or general meaning, but to be able to comprehend designated information in a context of longer stretches of spoken language. I think we do this also quite often. Responsive, not as much, but intensive and selective we do, because selective is like, listen to what you just heard, now answer the questions. And the last kind, extensive, is to help you develop a top-down global understanding of spoken language. And generally do this with much more lengthy types of listening, like lectures, listening to a conversation, where we're not looking for specific information. We want to make sure that in general they know what was going on. Generally, the tasks associated with this are note-taking, questioning, or discussion after the fact. And therefore, extensive, you have to have a pretty high level of English in order to actually participate in this activity. So let me show you a couple of examples. This is an example of an intensive listening activity, and I mean, we already said it's about phonemes and words, but I want you to see that there are different ways of testing that. Here's an example. So here, the test takers hear he's from California, and they have to choose between he's from California or she's from California. So here we're looking at the phoneme, right? And if they can distinguish between hearing he and she. And another example here with a phonemic pair and vowel sound. The test takers hear, is he living? And they read, is he leaving? Is he living? And again, well, here there's even a little bit of reading comprehension involved, right? Because you have to know how those are pronounced in order to get the correct answer. So I don't know if you guys are doing these sorts of things in your class to practice. Obviously, in order to assess them, we have to practice them in our class. So assessment and planning become intricately woven. If I want to eventually assess my students' capacity to distinguish between these phonemes, then I'm going to have to practice this way in the class. So are we doing this with listening? Another example of intensive listening. The test takers here, hello, my name's Kiko, I come from Japan. And the test takers read, Kiko is comfortable, Kiko wants to come to Japan, Kiko is Japanese, Kiko likes Japan. So this is intensive listening, but they're happening to understand what was meant to be communicated. So we're focusing on the idea of that sentence. The correct answer, Kiko, hello, my name's Kiko, I come from Japan. But Kiko is Japanese, right? Maybe he's comfortable, but it's not about him coming to Japan. And maybe he likes Japan, but that's not what's being communicated. Some examples of responsive listening. Ways to assess it, and I think that what I like here as this first example is that you can see that you can actually do this multiple choice also. So as you're working on designing your instruments for next week, that's why I'm trying to get these videos out to you sooner. I hope that this can be helpful for you in the designing of your instruments, because we don't always have time to do something more authentic and like the alternative assessment where they could actually carry out a dialogue, but we can still assess their listening skills and their hypothetical, get as close as we can, speaking skills by having them listen and then answer by circling the correct answer how they would respond. So here's an example. The test takers here, how much time did you take to do your homework? And they have to respond by circling the correct answer in about an hour, about $10, yes I did. If they understood the question correctly, then they should be able to answer it. Again, there's a cross variable here that they have to understand what they're reading in those answers. But we're testing their listening predominantly, the comprehension of that question, in order to respond. This is much more authentic than just the traditional fill in the blank, because I'm actually giving it a context. They're in a dialogue and responding. So this is an example of where traditional tests can be created more authentically when I don't have time to do something entirely authentic, like alternative assessment. Another example here of responsive listening, this is maybe kind of the obvious one. An open-ended question, the test takers here, how much time did you take to do your homework? And they either write or speak. Now, if I'm interviewing them, they would speak it. And if they're doing a test all sitting down together, I just play the question and they write their answer on the paper. So again, it's getting closer to more realistic, authentic communication. Here we have some examples of selective listening. And remember that selective, we said they're going to be a little bit more extensive texts where they have to deal with specific information. And here we have an example where it says, test takers here, ladies and gentlemen, I now have some connecting gate information for those of you making connections to other flights out of San Francisco. The ones that are blank is where they were going to have to write the missing words or phrases, so your traditional listen and fill in the blank. Here clearly the emphasis is on numbers. That's a selective listening. Another example here, and I don't think I see enough of this, the test takers here. Choose the correct picture. In my backyard, I have a bird feeder. Yesterday there were 2 birds and a squirrel fighting for the last few seeds in the bird feeder. The squirrel was on top of the bird feeder while the larger bird sat at the bottom of the feeder, screeching at the squirrel. The smaller bird was flying around the squirrel trying to scare it away. So based on that description they just listened to, they have to choose the right picture. This, if you remember correctly, in terms of sub-skills, is called listening to transfer information. It also has to do kind of with the main idea, but more than the main idea, they have to get each of those details in order to transfer that information to the correct picture. I don't know if you were able to identify which is the correct picture. Maybe we can see which one you agreed upon later. Extensive listening, the last one to give you a few examples. Here you have, there's a dialogue and multiple choice question comprehension items. So the test takers here. Now you will hear a conversation between Lynn and her doctor. You will hear the conversation 2 times. After you hear the conversation the second time, choose the correct answer. Mark your answers on the answer sheet provided. This, we do it all the time, right? They hear the whole thing and they answer questions about it. Although this one's pretty short considering the fact that in the definition it's extensive and generally longer lectures, but this is about as close as we can get in a typical classroom, right? Listen to the dialogue, answer the questions. Okay, so to conclude, this is all in your text, guys, in your text by Brown. So there are more examples if you need more examples to go back and look at it and think about how you're going to design your instruments for your Limited 2 that you turn in next week, as well as how you're going to design your instruments that you're applying at your schools, because that's going to depend upon your context. But here's a list of micro skills and macro skills that we can test and also therefore teach to our students. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'm just going to emphasize a few of them so that you see how many other things we can do with listening. For example, if you look at number 8, these are the micro skills. Recognizing grammatical word classes. We can do that through listening, if it's a noun, if it's a verb, based on what they heard. Or number 11, recognizing cohesive devices in spoken language. Do we have our students identify those? And macro skills, we can have our students, number 13, infer situations, participants, and goals using real world knowledge, more main idea global, or distinguish between literal and implied meaning. I like 16 also, use facial, kinesthetic, body language, and other nonverbal cues to decipher meanings. In that case, we're going to need the visual support as well, or in person, live, right? So that's the end of the video or the presentation. In classes, we'll be practicing identifying types of listening that you can look at the activity and tell me what type it is, and then vice versa also, where I can tell you I want you to design for me on intensive listening or selective listening, and you design it based on the context that you use. So that's what we'll be practicing in class, and also what you're expected to do for your portfolio as your last assignment of the semester. So good luck. See you soon.